When I first started out fly fishing, I remember watching some of my buddies fish and just being dumbfounded at how they managed to catch so many fish. It felt like they knew exactly what they were doing, and I was just getting lucky some of the time. I kept asking myself, what are they doing that I'm not? I was casting similar flies in similar water, so why wasn't I seeing a similar level of success? Well, those guys taught me a ton of lessons, but as I look back on all of them, there's 7 that really stick out. This week on Untangled, I'll share what those skills are and how they'll make you a better angler. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I am your host, Spencer Durant. We've got 7 skills to go over today, and I think it's important to reiterate that these are the skills that helped me the most. These are the lessons that, as I was prepping the episode this week, really stood out to me as the ones that moved me from that wide-eyed, overwhelmed angler standing in the river, just no clue what to do. Don't know what to do with my hands. How do I cast this fly rod? What's a mend? Why does everybody keep telling me to mend it? What's broken? It didn't even feel like you were drinking from a fire hose. It felt like you were drinking the whole daggum river in one gulp. That's how overwhelming it can be as a beginner. This is what moved me from that to, hey, I feel good about my ability to go read the river and say, I bet there's a fish there and there and there. And I can pick a fly out of my box and feel good and confident that this is a reasonable representation of what the fish are probably eating right now. These are the lessons that really stood out to me that helped me make that jump in my own angling experience. But I also wouldn't say that these are the only things to focus on. In fact, the first skill really addresses that. So let's just dive right into it. And skill number one to work on is you've got to understand that everything in fly fishing works together. Let's take the idea of a drag-free drift on a dry fly, for example. If you want a drag-free drift on your dry fly, then you've got to be able to make a good cast. You have to understand, in addition to making a good cast, you've got to understand how surface currents work. How are they going to grab your fly line and your leader? What's that going to do to the movement of your fly? And then on top of that, you've got to understand where to stand and where you want to set yourself up in the river so that you lessen the chance of that drag happening. So there's not just one skill involved in getting that drag-free drift. There's multiple skills that you have to combine and understand how they work together to achieve that drag-free drift. And let's take a step back again, look at this from the perspective of everything working together, and I'm going to illustrate this concept with a little bit of a story. I had this friend of mine, his name's Hiram Weaver. We're still friends. I shouldn't say I had, but he was, nothing happened to Hiram. He's fine. I just talked to him the other day, actually, but he lives back in Utah, and I moved out of Utah a while ago, so he and I just don't get the chance to fish together much anymore. But back when we were fishing together consistently, there was this little stretch of river that we would fish in, and there were some great fish in this river. I saw Hiram pull out just beautiful fish after fish from this thing. And what would usually happen is we'd go up there and Hiram would fish one of the runs. He'd run a cast through it, catch a fish, pretty nice one, and then he'd let me have a crack at it. And I would fish the same run, and I would come up blank more often than not. Not even just losing the fish or not catching a big one, just not catching anything. It was rare for me to catch something out of any of the spots that Hiram caught fish out of, even though I was using, in a lot of cases, the same flies as him, the same leader setup, the same everything, right? Within reason. I was using really similar stuff. And then I remember in particular, there was this one moment where Hiram let me fish first. So I run through this good looking run. I worked it well. I didn't catch anything, but I felt really good about it. I thought my flies were where they needed to be, and I was really happy, and I was confident that when I turned it over to Hiram to fish that he wasn't going to catch anything out of it. And I think 2 casts into it, he puts a 23-inch brown trout in the net. And I remember he's like, hey, I got a good one, and I'm looking at it. He puts it in the net, holds this giant brown trout up, and I'm like, looking at him like, he just kissed my sister, right? It felt like that. Like, brother, where do you get off doing this? I thought I did a really good job. He had the same flies that I had. Everything was the same. So what the heck was the difference there? What separated the two of us? Well, it's really simple, and it goes back to this core concept, which is I didn't really understand where my flies landed after I cast them. I didn't understand where my cast even landed. And then on top of that, I didn't understand how those two things work together to create the best possible presentation. So this is just one example of how much everything flows together within fly fishing. It's not just about doing one thing correctly and then ignoring the rest. There's a lot that goes into it. Even with a nymph drift, for example, you've got to make sure that your flies land where you want them, and then you've got to manage the drift and you've got to mend it. You've got to make sure there's no drag. You got to make sure you don't have too much slack. You got to pay attention to your strike indicator. There's a lot that goes into all of this. So let's dig into this even further, okay? Your flies need to be in front of the fish. So the fish has to move as little as possible to come get them. So that means, again, you need accurate casts that place the flies in the right spot, and you need to know what those right spots are. Often that's going to be along our seams, our depth changes, foam lines, next to undercut banks, underneath overhanging branches, or in the case of nymphs, it's going to be getting them at the right depth, making sure you're in the strike zone. You're in that bottom third of the water column that we talk about here all the time. So in order to make sure that your flies are landing where they need to be, you need to have a good, solid understanding of all those different water features because that's going to make a huge difference in how well you can pick water apart. So if you need any help learning how to read water, we've got an ebook about that. I'll throw a link to it in the show notes. But that's just one aspect of this, right? I needed to understand where my flies were and getting them in front of the fish. But then I also needed to understand where my cast lands, because you want your fly line and your leader to land in such a way that it extends the length of your drift as long as possible, whether that's dry flies or nymphs. That's what you want your cast to do. It needs to land in a way that your drift can go on for as long as possible. So when you're fishing pocket water, for example, you want your flies, your leader, and your line to all land on the same seam. You want them all next to each other, all nice and grouped up, because if your flies land in this pocket of calm water right behind the rock, but your fly line lands in the faster current, it's going to yank those flies right out of the pocket before the fish can even eat them, because that fast current is going to grab the line and just pull and yank, and the fish never really even has a chance to look at your flies. And that goes for any sort of nymphing. Often when we're nymphing, we're trying to get within these little seams or foam lines, and we're fishing transitions. So there might be a lot of fast water to the left and a lot of slow water to the right, and you're trying to land right in the middle. You don't want your flies not moving at all, and you don't want them zipping at 300 miles an hour downriver. You want them moving in the same line or relatively the same speed. So it doesn't just apply to dry flies, it applies to nymphs as well. So the moral of this tip, if I really had to boil it all down, is that as you are trying to learn all these things at the beginning, and you're trying to understand your cast and understand how to position yourself and what does drag look like and how can I tell a bad drift from a good drift, give yourself some patience because I didn't give myself any daggum patience. I remember there was one time I was out on the lower Provo River. This was years and years ago. And I was fishing. There was a caddis hatch coming off. And there were a couple of guys upstream of me. And they were just netting fish after fish. And I was getting refusals. And then I just wasn't getting anything. And I could not figure out what in the devil I was doing wrong. And I just kept hammering away. It gets dark and I kept going. There was enough light. I was in an area where there were some lights from the freeway and I could still kind of see. And I stayed until it was so dark that I could only hear, I could hear the fish rising And I ended up catching one. It was completely by accident. I thought it was all skill, but let's be honest, it was completely by accident. And I think I fished like 6 or 7 hours straight that day because I just said, I'm not going to go home until I catch this fish. I didn't give myself any room for understanding what I was doing wrong. I just tried to brute force my way through it. I think a lot of us fall into that trap with fly fishing. We just try to brute force our way through things. There's a lot of power in being able to just say, if I could go back to that younger version of me and say, dude, take a step back from the river, think about why it's not working. I probably would have been successful at some point that evening instead of just going and really just hammering away at it until I got lucky and snagged a fish. If you can do that, if you can take a step back and be patient and not get upset with yourself, because you've got all these skills to learn as you're fishing. You've got to learn everything. You got to combine it all, and then you've got to not fall in the river while you're doing it, which ain't as easy as it sounds, right? Give yourself some grace, have some patience, be willing to just step back from everything for a minute, look and analyze what might be going wrong or not, and that's really going to help you out. So that's your tip number 1. The second skill that you really ought to work on is the reach cast. Now, the reach cast, it's a handy little tool that really helps with a lot of what I talked about with that first skill, because the reach cast is a way for you to land all of your fly line upstream of your fly before the fly even lands on the water. So you're making sure that all this line is up above the fly before it even lands on the water, so that you don't have to throw any sort of mend after your fly's on the water. And this is most effective in dry fly fishing when you're in a run or a riffle or even a pool. It can really be helpful there. And you're casting kind of across the water, either directly across or you're at about a 45-degree angle upstream. You're not casting directly upstream of you like you might be in some situations. Maybe you're on a wider piece of water and you've just got to get the flies to those fish a little bit further out. That's where the reach cast really comes into play. So it's really simple, because you're essentially just making a mend in your fly line before it hits the water. It helps to visualize. That's what you're trying to accomplish before you set out to do it. That's always what helps me with a lot of these different casting techniques is, what am I trying to accomplish? Visualize it, and then it makes it a little bit easier for me to try and accomplish that with the fly rod out on the water. So what you're going to do to accomplish this is you're going to stop the fly rod a little bit earlier than normal on the final forward stroke of your cast. So you're making your casts, and you're going to stop the fly rod just a little bit early, and then you're going to move the rod upstream when you do that. What that's going to do is that stop and then the movement of the rod pulls a lot of the fly line upstream, and then it's going to land your fly with all the fly line above it. And Pete Kutzer from Orvis, he's got a great video on this. I'll link that in the show notes. I know it's a lot easier to watch stuff about casting than it is to listen to somebody describe it. But by landing all of the fly line above your fly, you're accomplishing a few things, okay? You're removing the possibility of different currents dragging on the line and then causing your fly to drag. So you're extending your drift a little bit. And then you are also just giving yourself more time to get the fish to see that fly in a natural way. Now, you could accomplish the same thing with a mend as soon as your fly line lands. But with a mend, you do run the risk of moving your fly, maybe pulling it out of the feeding lane a little bit, or even pulling the fly significantly towards you. A reach cast lets you do all of that before your fly ever hits the water. So you get this really great drift without any extra movement on your fly. And that's really the second benefit of the reach cast is I think it just makes it look a lot more natural, because there's no little skitter or little bounce or little bump. It's just a very dead drift after you've made that reach cast. And then just as an example of how effective this can be and how much it can change your fortunes, what day is it? Yeah, just a couple of days ago, Alex and I have been out. We've been busy making some new content for you guys. But a couple of days ago, we were out on the water, and Alex was fishing through this run, and I'd caught one or two. It wasn't very good fishing, but I'd caught just a couple. And Alex was further down in the run from me, and he'd thrown maybe 20 or 30 casts through the run. He felt like he had the depth right with his flies. He was nymphing. He really liked his fly choice, but he knew something was wrong with the presentation. So he had a lot of really slow water in front of him, and faster water where he wanted his flies to drift. So what he did is he threw a big old reach cast, and the fly line landed well to the right side of his indicator, so it evened out the drift. So the flies weren't being pulled on. They were able to sink and get down nice and low, right where they needed to be. And 5 seconds after he threw that first reach cast, fish smacked his flies. He got a nice little rainbow into the net. So sometimes it really can be just that much of a difference maker. And you can use this reach cast with nymphing because, again, if you're in a position where you need your flies to drop for a minute, let's say you've got that fast water further from you but slow water in front of you, just like what Alex described, you can throw that reach cast, and if you throw it in such a way that all your fly line isn't pulling on that indicator, it lets the flies drop straight down before the indicator starts moving maybe in that slower current. So that's just another example of how effective the reach cast can be. The third skill to focus on and to develop is false casting as little as possible. Now, I remember when I got into this and I started out, I would false cast so much. I'd stand there in the river. I thought I looked so stinking cool false cast. And I had my dad's old vest. I had his old rod and I had my fancy dancy waders. And I'd stand there false casting. And I had this dream that people would look at me and oh yeah, that's a serious fly fisherman right there. Yeah, he knows what he's doing. Look at those false casts. Those are beautiful. Yeah. No, that's not what happens. And all that excessive false casting does is just make it more likely that you're going to tangle your flies up. That's really the big downside to false casting is the more time your flies spend in the air in that cast, especially if you've got more than one fly on your rig, you dramatically increase the chances that you are going to tangle all of those up. Another issue with too much false casting is it can actually spook fish, especially in low and clear water. If the fish they're feeling a little uneasy, they're not quite sure that they're safe. There's bugs out there, but they're not really into it yet. They're not really chowing down on the bugs yet. Too much line zipping over their head can really spook them, especially on more pressured rivers, especially like a tailwater. They can really get sensitive to that. And then the last reason, again, that you don't want to focus on too much false casting, it's kind of simple, but fish, they live in the water. They don't live in the air. So the more time your flies spend in the water, the much better chance you have of catching a fish. The goal that I use is I want to get my flies to the target in 3 casts or less. That's what I always try to do. And I think more often than not, I'm successful at it. Sometimes I do still fall into that trap of false casting too much, but I try to correct it as soon as I see that happening. And that 3 casts or less maxim was shared with me by an incredibly accomplished angler, a guy I know who's fished all over the world, has caught some beautiful fish on a fly rod. And that's what he always tried to do as well, was get it to the fish within 3 casts or less. So I've tried to do that myself. The fourth skill to develop is all about watching the fish instead of watching your flies. Now that might sound counterintuitive for a minute, so let me explain. And it's not, this isn't always possible either, but if you're nymphing or if you're fishing a dry dropper rig in a place where you can see the fish, sometimes it will pay off immensely to watch the fish instead of watching just your flies. If you can watch both at once, that's really good, but it's kind of hard to have your eyes stare in 2 directions at once sometimes. But if you can't watch both, sometimes watch that fish, because fish can actually eat and spit out your flies without moving your indicator. if you're nymphing, or without moving your dry fly. If you've got a dry dropper, it's actually eerie. There was this video years ago. I've looked for it, but I can't find it, of some guys out on the water showing this exact concept. They had nymphs drifting in the water, and they had it set up so you could see the indicator and the nymph rig and the trout, and you could watch the trout suck the fly in and spit it out almost instantly, and then you could see the indicator not move, not even stop at all, because they can just get rid of it so quick that it never registers with whatever you're using to indicate that a fish ate your nymph. So with that in mind, okay, if you can watch the fish, if you can watch them move, you can still see when they move on it, because they can spit it out quick, but if you can watch them move, you might be able to snag them. Okay, I'll give you an example. Last summer, I'm up here, I'm on my favorite cutthroat stream, and I see this really big cutthroat. He's just parked in these riffles. He's going to town. He's eating. I think there were caddis coming off. He is like me at the food court in the mall with somebody else's credit card, right? Endless options, and he's going to try every last dadgum thing. And I had a dry dropper rig on, so I throw my dry dropper rig up there. I had a elk hair caddis on and then a Frenchie as the dropper. And as my dry fly passed by its head, he didn't eat the dry, but I saw the fish. He moved over just slightly, and he moved towards my fly because I was a couple inches to his right, I think. I didn't even see its mouth open. I just saw the fish move. And as soon as it moved, I just went ahead and set the hook, because I've experienced this a little bit, and I knew, okay, he moved. There's an extremely good chance that as my fly passed, he moved to eat my nymph. And wouldn't you know it, I hooked that fish. And it was a pretty nice sized cutthroat too. One of the biggest I've actually caught from that stream, I did using this technique. And again, this is something I've experienced and I've worked on a lot over the years, is being able to watch the fish and look for that and setting when they move. Because if you always depend on watching your bobber or your dry fly to tell you if a fish ate your nymph, you're going to miss a lot of fish. This is partly why Euro nymphing or tightline nymphing is so popular, because you can see so many more of the takes. You can feel so many more of the takes as well. But if you're not fishing that way, okay, if you just got your nymphs on, your dry dropper, and you're in water that's clear enough to see it, watch for the fish movement, or even just watch for their mouth opening. Sometimes that's all you'll see. You'll just see their mouth open. There's going to be this white flash because the inside of their mouth is white, usually stands out really well against darker water. And as soon as you see that, you can set the hook as soon as you see that white flash. And then often you'll find that hook gets right in the corner of their mouth. It's a really good, strong hook set. So this is a skill that it's a little more situational, but it is very effective once you learn how to do it. And once you learn how to watch those fish, it's really going to help you catch a few more. The fifth skill to work on is understanding fish behavior, and then how that behavior relates to the seasons that we experience throughout the year. Because fish are not in these same spots year round. That'd be really nice and helpful if they all just held in the same spot every day of the year, but that's just not what happens. And we've talked about this a lot lately. We've done a lot of winter and then early spring themed episodes here lately. And the fish will really hunker down in these deep pools and the deeper runs during the winter, because bug activity dies down as the water temps drop. And then once things start to warm up, the bugs start moving again. They start hatching again, and the fish will start moving into the riffles and the faster runs to feed again, because they're following the bug life. The bugs are hanging out in the riffles and the faster runs because there's a lot of oxygen in that water. That's really good habitat for aquatic insects. So the fish will go into that once those bugs start eating, because there's enough food in this faster water to make the energy the fish spend in it worth it, because they can eat so much more. In the winter, if they stayed in those riffles in the winter, they would just spend way too much energy hanging out, because the only stuff really available to them in those riffles are going to be the midges, and then maybe the odd scud or sow bug that gets knocked loose. A lot of the scuds and sow bugs and worms, they're going to be in a lot of that slower water too. That's a lot of where their habitat is. They like a lot of the moss. And yeah, you'll find them under rocks, but get them in that slower stuff, and they'll really, especially when it's cold outside, that's really where they're going to congregate. Okay. And fish, the bugs aren't the only thing that slow down in the winter. The fish slow down as well when it gets cold. They're not going to eat as much or as aggressively when the water temps get cold. But once the water warms up around 50 degrees, up to about 65, the trout are active. They're very happy. They're eating a lot. They're like me on Thanksgiving. They're just going to town on everything they see except the stuffing, because nobody likes stuffing. The best anglers understand these trends. They understand that, okay, it's getting warmer and the fish are moving, the bugs are moving. Okay. So they are going to change where they fish and how they fish year round. They're not going to use the same rigs year round either, because things change, right? I usually only nymph like 2-3 nymphs under an indicator all day. I usually only do that kind of nymphing during the winter and then the early spring, because that's the most effective way to catch fish that time of year. Okay. I'll throw streamers in the fall and spring when the fish are really active on them, but most of the time it's going to be the dry droppers for me throughout the rest of the year, because it's the most effective way to cover all the water that's most likely holding fish, because I can get into those faster runs and riffles. And then of course they're looking for the dry flies because they're actually hatching. I actually used to fish. There was this river I fished all the time growing up, and I would fish the same spots on it year round. And I could never understand why I never caught any fish during the winter from these same spots. It never clicked for me. But then once summer rolled around, I'd catch fish just fine. And it took me a long time before I finally made that connection that, oh, there's winter runs and there's summer runs, and there's winter habitat and there's summer habitat. And as you start to put those pieces together and understand where the fish live during the different seasons, you're really going to increase your understanding of fish behavior, and it's going to just eliminate a lot of the guesswork of where the fish going to be today. Okay, another example from that recent trip Alex and I took. It's early spring. Okay, things are warming up. It's not quite warm enough for the fish to be all the way in the riffles, but they're definitely not sulking in the deep stuff as much anymore. So we were looking for very specific water. We were looking for a little bit faster water, ideally that went from shallow to deep, that went onto a shelf or a deep bucket. That's what we were looking for. And as we fished, we were there for 3 days. And as we fished, almost every single fish we caught came from that exact type of water, where it was a little bit quicker. It was almost walking speed. It was deep, but it wasn't deep and super slow. It was deep, but still moving with a consistent speed. And it was just that simple, just looking for that kind of water and identifying it. But 2 or 3 months from now, they're going to be in slightly different water as things progress. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about all these different bug trends, we actually have a year-round hatch chart to help you with all that. I'll link that down in the show notes as well if you want to take a look at it. The 6th tip to remember is you've got to fish the entire river. And now I'm notorious for not doing this, and you can ask Alex about this. We'll go fish somewhere, and I want to fish the same runs as the last time because I know the fish are there. I like the confidence of being in water that I know holds some fish. But Alex is much more willing to explore and try and find new stuff. And there's a lot I can learn from him for that, because fish will surprise you. They will hold in different spots throughout the year, just like we've talked about. But even during the same season, the fish will often move around a lot. And sometimes they'll just be in random places. And you never know unless you go outside your comfort zone a little bit, fish the whole river, fish all the good-looking water. You're never going to have that experience. My local stream, for example, this happened a few times last summer where I fished a section, I did amazing, and then I went back the next day and I caught nothing. Because the fish in my stream, they move around a lot, and I'm still getting used to that because back in Utah where I lived before, the fish didn't move around near as much. So it's been a bit of a learning curve, if I could talk, a learning curve for me. If I was a lot more willing to explore and just try out new sections, be more willing to get skunked, then I'd probably catch a few more fish. So this is a tip I still really need to work on for myself. And the best anglers I know, they're the ones who thoroughly work through every piece. Like I said earlier, working through every piece of fishy looking water. They don't just fall into that rut of fish the same spots, fish it with the same flies, fish it the same way, stand in the same spot, face the same direction, wear the same socks, lucky underwear, the whole shebang. They don't do that, okay? And as a consequence of that, they actually identify more and more places that fish might hold. They start to understand how many different types of riffles exist, or I'm trying to think of a better way to describe it than that. They start to understand the difference between really good water and then marginal water, which might hold a fish, and then water that's almost certainly not going to hold a fish. And then they can still fish all of that very thoroughly, very effectively. And you'll be really surprised once you do this at just how much of that translates from river to river as well. So fish the whole river, really push yourself to do that, and I promise you're going to see some great results from it. And skill number 7 is you got to make that first cast count. I know we've talked a lot about casting today, but it really is critical to your success on the water. But out of all the casts that you make, that first one is the most important. There was this high school basketball coach that I used to know, and he always said, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And that's fantastic fly fishing advice. Now, he used it as an excuse to wear way too much cologne, but that's kind of beside the point. Okay, your first cast through a run often has, as long as it's good, often has the best chance of catching a fish, especially if you're fishing dry flies, okay? Because getting everything lined up beforehand so that you're sure that your line, your leader, and your tippet, and your fly will all land in the same current and that you won't line the fish and that you're standing in the right spot. You can do all that before you throw that first cast. It's going to make a huge difference in how successful you are, because the second that your fly line hits the water, the fish can wise up pretty quick to your presence, especially if they're picky, especially if they've been caught a lot before. They know what that looks like. They know what that feels like. Even when nymphing, okay, you might be surprised at how many fish refuse to give a nymph a second look if the first time it goes by their face, it's not in the right spot, or it's got drag on it. Okay, that first cast counts, so make it count good for you. Make it work well for you, and I promise you're going to see that pay off in the long run as well. So again, these 7 tips, these 7 skills, they really do make a difference, and these are the things that, as I've been able to, we go all the way back to the first tip, as I've been able to combine all of these and remember all of these and utilize them every time I'm out on the water, these have made the biggest difference for me in going from, I don't know what I'm doing, to I feel like I can catch a fish today. And I know it's going to do the same for you. So get out there on the water. Above all, get out, spend time on the water doing these things. And then you're going to learn other lessons that might even supplant these, add to these, whatever. But you're going to learn other things that are also going to help you. But you got to get that time on the water to experience it. So make sure you're out there. And if you've got any other questions about these tips, please don't hesitate to leave a comment, reach out. I'd love to explain something further if you need it. But with that, folks, we're going to wrap up the intro to today's show, and we're going to go right into the Q&A section for this week's show.
One of the most frequently asked questions we get from both beginners and experienced anglers is, what fly should I use? With the thousands of fly patterns that exist, it can be completely overwhelming. That's why we've put together an entire ebook that walks you through everything about bugs and picking the right fly, no matter where you're fishing. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this ebook for free. All right, back to the show.
Every week, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, please go ahead and submit that to us at the link in the show notes. And the first question this week comes to us from the Great White North. Daniel from Canada writes in and says, Hey, Spencer, I've recently been setting up all my gear, and I'm curious if you prefer gel floatant or powder floatant and why. I bought powder floatant, and it does seem to work. I'd love to hear your preference. Thanks for all the great content. This has been an invaluable asset to me as I learn my way through this. Daniel, thank you, and good question. Appreciate you writing this in. So I actually use both. I use both types of floatant. And what I do is I get my dry flies tied on, and then I'll use the gel floatant first. I use the Loon Aquel. That's what the whole team here at VFC uses. That's what we put in our starter packs. It's a good product. We believe in it. Works very well for us. But once my fly starts to sink, once the Aquel starts to wear off throughout the day, instead of putting more Aquel on it, I actually go to the Loon Top Ride. It's a dry shake. So you literally stick your fly in it and then shake it. It's like you're playing maracas or something. It's kind of fun. And it is, you do shake on this little white powder. I found that's the most effective form of the powder floatants. The other stuff that you pull out and you brush onto the fly, I found that you lose most of that because it blows away, and then the brush doesn't really work it into the hackle fibers too well. It's just messy. The shake stuff just seems so much more effective and economical at the end of the day. The brush on ones are just a pain in the butt. So I would shy away from those if I were you. But you don't have to do that system. This is just what I've done. I'll shake my fly off, dry it off, and then it's good to go. You could also just dry your fly off. You can just blow on it and reapply the liquid floatant, the gel floatant throughout the day as well. There's no rule that says my system's better. It's just what I use. It's the system I've developed over my fishing experience, and it seems to work really well for me. So give it a shot. Let me know how it goes. So thanks a bunch for sending your question. I appreciate it. Herschel from Mississippi has our next question, writes in and says, when I attempt to do a dry dropper rig and I need to mend the line, I almost always pull the dry fly under the water. Then it doesn't want to float. Is this the nature of the game, or is there a trick to mending a dry dropper rig? By the way, I purchased the fly assortment boxes. Love them. Thank you. Herschel, thanks for the question, and I'm glad to hear you like the fly assortment boxes. Great to hear, man. Thank you. So it sounds like you're mending a little bit incorrectly, and I'm not coming down on you like, Herschel, dadgummit, you ain't mending right, you idiot. It's not where I'm coming from at all. Promise. Because I still do this sometimes, and I did this a bunch when I was starting out. So it's nothing to feel bad over. But when you mend your fly line, your flies, and this applies to your bobber if you're nymphing as well, shouldn't move at all. That is the goal of the mend, because all you're trying to do is moving just your fly line and leader, moving them upstream of that bobber or that dry fly so that you don't have any drag. You're extending the length of the drift, making it look as natural as possible. That's the whole point of a mend. Now, I know it's a lot easier said than done. Trust me. I'm very well of that fact. And again, I ain't perfect at it still. But it's helpful if you think of the act of mending as picking up and moving fly line instead of treating it like a cast. I talk to some beginners, and I see some beginners who have that issue where they treat mending almost like it's its own cast. And that's really when they can run into some issues. It's not a cast. You're literally just picking up and moving fly line. So the other thing to focus on is that you want to lift and move your line for that mend. You want to lift and move in one fluid motion. If you lift your rod, you pause a little bit, and then you try to flick the rest of the line where you want it, you're going to end up pulling that fly down sometimes, or you're going to end up throwing just not a good mend either. You're going to really not do anything to make that mend effective. So you want to lift your rod, you want to point towards your fly or your bobber, and then pick up and move the line. And often you're going to snap your wrist just a little bit to help roll the line in the right direction. And with your specific problem where you're pulling the flies down, a lot of times that also means that either you've waited too long to make the mend, because if you have a huge belly in your line that's downstream from your dry fly, and you go to pick that up, there's so much pressure pushing on that line that it's going to push that line under the water. And then, of course, that's going to pull on your dry fly and pull that under the water as well. So if you wait too long to do the mend and there's already a big belly of line below it, then yeah, you're going to have some issues at that point. The other problem could be that you just don't have enough line out, because if you have a really tight connection to that fly and you go to mend, then once again, there's going to be enough pressure from the water on the surface that's just going to pull everything underneath the water. Because if you try to lift, because our floating fly lines, as great as they don't always float completely on top of the water. Sometimes they're a little in the surface film. So if you've got this really tight connection to that fly and you go to lift, then if a little bit of your fly line is stuck in the surface film, it can just pull everything else down and run into that issue. So you might not even have enough fly line out in the first place, where you're just lifting and pulling and there's no slack, there's no room for that fly to move at all. Okay, that could cause some issues as well. Now, I know mending can be a tough thing to just listen to and get tips on. So I'll link our video on mending in the show notes. It goes over all of this as well. But again, the thing to remember is that you need to think of a mend as moving your fly line. You got to practice this as much as you possibly can. Okay, practice moving that fly line without your bobber or your dry fly moving at all. And this is one thing that you can practice casting anywhere, like a park, your yard, the street, wherever you want to practice casting, you can do it. But mending, you really got to be on the water for, because there's the surface tension of the water. There's all the currents that you've got to deal with. So maybe set aside some time next time you're out on the water, practice your mends, really put some effort into making sure they look good and that you're not moving your fly or your bobber with it. And I think that'll help. Eventually, I promise, it's all going to come together. Michael from New Mexico has our next question. Writes in and says, "Gentlemen, I really enjoy what you are doing. I've been doing a fair amount of road tripping of late, and Spencer has become a regular companion, almost as if he's sitting shotgun. I've been through a fair number of episodes, but I've yet to find one related to the show's namesake, Untangled. While I anticipate that this is not an issue for fly fishing Zen masters like yourselves, my question pertains to the counter situation, tangles. One of the show's implied truths is that you'll catch more fish the more time you have flies in the water. So, over the years, I've had more than a few tangles where I've spent way too much time sitting on the side of the water attempting to unsnarl my rig, only to give up and cut off the cluster and re-rig. My question for you is, how and when do you guys make the decision to cut and re-rig versus attempting to untangle a mess? I will admit that some situations seem obvious. However, I seem to always think that I can untangle a mess quicker than the time it will take to re-rig, only to spend way too much time with my flies out of the water. In some cases, I've spent the time attempting to untangle a knot, only to cut it out and re-rig anyway. I suspect there may be no way around my compulsive nature, but I'd like to hear how you would approach the situation." Michael, thanks for the question, the good things you say. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry I'm riding shotgun with you. Your vehicle probably smells like wings and Diet Coke now, but maybe you're welcome for that. No, I do appreciate the kind words. Thank you so much. Be completely honest, I'm kind of the same way as you. I am notorious for wanting to untangle things, but I've also gotten a lot less patient. The longer I've fished, I just am a lot more willing to cut and retie, but I've also gotten a lot quicker at re-rigging. That's just one of the things. The more you do this, the quicker you're going to get at re-rigging. So the thought of cutting, retying, and re-rigging doesn't sound all that bad. That's why I cut and retie a lot more tangles, I think, than I used to. So for me, the personal cutoff line is if I can see that the flies they've wrapped around the leader a few times. The leader and tippet have just twirled around each other a little bit. They've done a little do-si-do that do-si didn't, right? Or if they've tied a simple little overhand knot together, then I'll usually just spend a minute. I'll pick that out. I can usually get those out fairly quickly. I can thank a summer of guiding for that. But if the tangle gets any more complex than that, I just cut and retie. A good example, yesterday I was out on the water with Alex, and I tangled both of our lines because we were fishing kind of closer to each other and I wasn't paying attention, and I got my line on top of his and it was a stupid mess. And I just I looked at it, and I could see that one of my nymphs had just twirled around his 4 or 5 times, and then they looped around each other a little bit. So there weren't multiple knots. It didn't look like a bird's nest. I could see it. It took me maybe 2 minutes to get it completely undone, and then we were back and we were fishing. So that's the most complex that I will do. And then a couple of weeks ago, I was out on the water with my friends Gene and Kyle, and Kyle was on the oars, Gene was in the back, and I was in the front. And it was another case of me just not watching. I cast right over Gene's rig. And it was one of those casts where, and if you fished at all, you understand this. You just throw it and you think, oh, that tangle's not going to be bad. And then you pull it up and it's like more line than you ever had somehow got tangled together. And it's like one of those impossible yarn balls that just cannot be undone. And that's what it looked like. And I didn't even know where half that line came from. It felt like, so that one I just cut and re-rigged completely because there was no saving it. Another reason, right, that I will cut and retie a lot more than I used to is tangled line. When it's bad, when the tangles get really bad, if that line gets kinked up quite a bit, it can actually lose a little bit of its strength. And that those kinks in the line can also decrease how sensitive it is. So if you've got a nymph rig on and you tangle, then it's all crinkly, looks like a little French fry or something. You may not feel the takes because that line has to stretch out a little bit more before the strike registers. I actually had that happen to me on Pyramid Lake years ago, where I was fishing the same rig for days and it had been tangled, and it was so crinkly and just stretched out that I actually watched one fish come up and eat, and I didn't realize it had eaten until my indicator was underwater. But my indicator, by the time I did that, I set, but there was so much stretch in the line from all those kinks that the fish spat the hook out and swam off. That was just one of many times that I got my butt kicked at Pyramid. So that's one reason why I just cut and retie a lot more now. And then again, the upside is that the more that you cut and retie, the faster that you're going to get at re-rigging. It'll eventually take a lot less time. And then the more you fish, again, the more you're going to get a feel for how long or involved a tangle is going to be just by looking at it. You can make a judgment call at that point with whether you want to untangle it or not. But again, I just err on the side of cutting things. It just seems to be a lot simpler and a lot quicker for me. Now, if you want to avoid tangles as much as possible, which I reckon a lot of us do because we're listening to Untangled. Come on, it's in the name. Especially if you've got more than one fly on, is you really got to focus on your casting mechanics. That's the culprit for a lot of tangles. Tailing loops are a major cause of tangles, and a tailing loop happens when you push your rod forward too soon during the casting stroke. So you've gone back, but you haven't allowed that back cast enough time to fully straighten out behind you. And then when you move the rod forward anyways, this causes the line to hit itself in the air. And that causes a lot of the worst tangles, the ones that we call wind knots. They're not actually wind knots, they're bad casting knots. And then one other tip for avoiding tangles, if your fly line or a bit of the leader wraps around the tip of your fly rod, I'm sure we've all seen this a lot. Don't just wiggle your rod and hope that it'll come undone. That's a recipe to just make it even worse, okay? If you see any little signs of tangles, go ahead and stop, okay? Strip the line in, stick the rod in the water, get up to the tip, untangle it from around the tip. Okay, the more that you try to wiggle it, or even if you ignore it and try to throw some casts, the bigger chance you have of it just turning into this giant bird's nest. So hopefully you got something out of that. I appreciate the question. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap up the Q&A section for this week, but don't go anywhere because we've got the Live Real Life moment next. Every week here on Untangled, we end the show by sharing stories and pictures from viewers and listeners out there on the water who are living real life. We love to see y'all out there having a good time catching fish, and we want to hear about it. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment that you would like to share, you can send those in at the link in the show notes. And this week's Live Real Life moment, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, so forgive me if I'm not, is from Tenoch. Writes in and says, "This salmon was caught on the Kenai River on my birthday this year. It has been a dream of mine to be in Alaska, catch a salmon, and cook it up. My wonderful girlfriend helped me out landing fish that day and took the picture. The lesson I learned was that even though it's great to have moments of solitude, at the end of the day, it's about spending what little time we have with our loved ones, making memories." Tight lines. Tenoch, that's awesome. Thanks for the story. The Kenai is a really cool place, isn't it? I'm very blessed to have been able to fish there a few times, and it hasn't gotten old for me yet. It's so cool. Alaska's a wonderful place. And how about catching salmon, cooking it up right there, girlfriend with you? That seems like a blast. You're right. Those memories really are what makes this stuff. Not that I'm trying to make this about us or anything, but just to prove your point that it really does matter to have folks there. Alex caught his personal best brown trout a couple of days ago, 24.5-inch brownie. And I was stoked just to be the net man on that fish. I can't imagine how stoked he was to actually catch it. But it was a bit of a rodeo to get that fish in. So the fact that we did that together, I know both Alex and I are going to remember that for a very long time. It was just a memorable way to put a fish in the net like that. So Tenoch is completely right here. It really does make a difference when you're able to share those moments with somebody else. So thanks a bunch for sending that in. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap up the show this week. Thank you so much for listening to us, for watching, however you're consuming the show, and wherever you're listening to it. If you could, please take a minute to rate and subscribe to the show. The more ratings and subscriptions we get means we can reach a wider audience and help them live a real life and have a fantastic time out on the water. And speaking of that, if you want to learn more or just engage more with what we've got here at VFC, we've got tons of content you can check out. It's all free. There's links everywhere. So click on whatever you're interested in. And until next week, everybody, get out, take advantage of this warm weather that's coming in finally. Have some fun and live real life.